I seem to have lost my sewing chair, but never mind, we have a bit of cutting out to do first. So if we drag ourselves back to our pattern, we have finished our background and we're going to start paying attention now to this swoosh. And I'm going to do that in a crazy patchwork technique, and I'm going to do it in shades of yellow. And also, because I want to get a little bit of a sense of depth coming from the back round to the front, I'm going to start at the back with very pale desaturated yellows, and they're going to get more vivid as they come towards the front. Hey there, I got my chair back. So if that was the end of the beginning, let's think of this as the beginning of the middle. So we're going to make the swoosh, and here I have a box of yellow scraps. I've gone through my scrap box and I've pulled out things all the way from, of course I can't find it now, pale creams, like this, right up to very vivid bluey, or very vivid yellows, even into oranges, and some very striking mustards. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to graduate the colours, so it's going to be very pale at the back and get more and more vivid as it comes forward, just to give a sense of perspective, so you have a feeling that this is further away than this. But this is just my design. I mean, obviously you can design anything you want and use the same techniques. And just to show you what this looks like when it's made up, it's essentially a two-part process. You make up enough material for what you want. So this was one I was doing before in purples, and you can see it's all sorts of little scrappy bits. And I would have been making that up looking through the pattern, or placing it on the pattern and checking that I had enough. And then we're going to cut out our swoosh, and we're going to essentially do English paper piecing. So we're going to tack the fabric onto the swoosh and then place it on our background. So first of all, I'm going to do the crazy piecing with you, and then we'll move on to doing the applique stage. I've sorted my scraps a little bit, and I've also cut out the swoosh because, as I say, we're going to be wrapping the fabric that we make with the crazy patchwork around that and then appliquing it onto our background. So I've just sort of sorted them into, as you can see, kind of cream colours on the right, and then swooshing down into a middle area that will probably be those kind of discreet yellows, let's call them. And then down the front, sorry, I'm not used to my camera. Down the front we have the very vivid yellows going towards orangey mustardy colours. So we'll get going on those now. Okay, I'm going to keep my swoosh to hand because I'll be checking from time to time if I have enough fabric made. And by fabric I mean the patchwork that I'm going to do, the crazy patchwork that I'm going to do. So I'll put it to one side, but I'll keep it to hand, and I'll get my little bundles sorted out and realise I'll be working upside down to you. But basically I have, my scraps are in sort of roughly rectangular shapes. I mean, you don't have to be too picky about it or anything. And I'm going to start at the back with something that's really very pale, and maybe attach that one to it. Doesn't matter if they're not the same size or anything. If you have a straight edge and a straight edge, you're grand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pair up a few of these pieces as best I can, and then we'll press them and then we'll trim them. So those two and maybe those two, and you'll sort of see how it functions now in a minute. So off to the machine. 1/4 inch seam again. Okay, so there's the 3 pairs that I've put together, and they're a bit chunky at the moment, but I will cut them down a little bit and then join them in other ways. So this is where your ruler and rotary cutter come in, and you wish you bought a new blade. See there that they would make a nice pair actually. If I straighten off this other side, it might be a better pairing because we'll have a very obviously staggered join, which will be nice. See? So I'll sew those together. And then we might decide to include these guys. So one of the ways you can do this actually is to slightly overlap the 2 pieces that you're going to join, and rotary cut through both pairs, and then you'll have a join that's absolutely matched. I really need a new cutter. See? So I'll join those. Right side of your pattern up on the right side of your fabric. And don't forget that we do need to leave ourselves space for a seam allowance all the way around as well. So that's coming along nicely. We'll add one more bit here. I'm just going to mark with a pin where the bottom edge of what we're doing at the moment is, so that I can come back to it without confusion the next time I measure. So I've kept adding on pieces and graduating through from the cream colour through the pale yellows, mid yellows, and around to the deep yellows. And I think I have enough now to cover my piece of pattern, more or less. So that's the next step. So having worked with placing the front of the pattern on the front of the fabric, we now need to turn everything over and pin the pattern to the back of the fabric. We can go right off the edge here, don't forget, because that's going to be the raw edge of the finished piece. So just making sure that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance around everything, more or less. Yeah, we can pin that in place. So it's fully pinned now, and I've also trimmed away the excess to about, it's a generous 1/4 inch, more like a 1/3 inch all the way around. And what I need really is just enough to be able to fold it over and tack it onto the fabric, much as we do with English paper piecing. In fact, exactly as we do with English paper piecing. And then we'll be able to applique it on. Now, I will draw your attention to the fact that the edges, so that goes off the outside edge, this goes off the outside edge, and that little tiny bit there at the top goes off the outside edge. I haven't left a seam allowance there, so I won't be wrapping it around there because we'll only be cutting that bit off anyway. So the next step for me now is to do that wrapping and tack it all in place. So yeah, we're going to start tacking around the outer edge, folding our seam allowance over. And I say tacking, but in actual fact I take fairly small stitches because you want the finish to be quite precise. And just take out your pins as you go along. It's no problem going around the outer edge of a curve in this manner because all you're doing is folding over. So I will have no problem here or along here. But when I get to the inner part of the curve, I'll slow down again and I'll show you. We might have to make a couple of little cuts just to ease the fold because otherwise the fabric will be being stretched. It's that sort of narrow curve will be being stretched over a wider curve and it may lead to buckling or distortion, but I'll slow down when I get to that. Actually, I've been lucky enough here that just about where I would have needed to put a cut for easement, I've got the end of a seam and that's allowing me to go around without cutting it. But if you have to make a cut, that's fine. Just make sure it doesn't go through for, you know, it doesn't have to go all the way to the edge. Just something to allow the natural stretch in the fabric to stretch a bit more, I suppose. And that's our tacking done. So now the next step is to pin it and tack it onto the background. So I gave my background another good ironing and I cut it down to 12.5 inch square with my 12.5 inch square ruler. And in actual fact, you can see where I was a little bit mean with my 1/4 inch seams. The whole thing crept up. Each of these is a smidge more than an inch wide. And it means that when I trimmed to 12.5, I lost a bit of my top strip and a bit of my bottom strip. I erred on the side of keeping more of the bottom one because it's about the spring. But it's not going to make a huge difference to the overall look of the thing. And I'm ready now to line this up. And hopefully it will fit beautifully. And in actual fact, even though I've gone and put a seam along there, I needn't have bothered because that's off the edge as well. So it's just a question of pinning this in place and then tacking it in place. Now it seems like we're doing an awful lot of pinning and tacking, but I think it's worth it just for the sake of accuracy, and you'll appreciate it in the final finish of the piece, I think. So once we have it pinned, it's more tacking, and then we will stitch it on, still with the paper inside it. We'll sort that out at the end. So that's us tacked. So it's just a question of pins out, and then we're ready to do some very neat stitching over the edges overstitch, whip stitch, applique stitch. There are a couple of stitches you could use and a couple of names for most of those stitches, but whatever way you do it small and neat, and you'll have a result that you're happy with. Okay, so I'm actually going to choose, I think, a fairly pale yellow thread to do this stage of the procedure with, because we're at a disadvantage in that we've got colours changing in the background and colours changing in the foreground. So no matter what we match our thread to, it's not going to be a perfect match the whole way along. So if I go for something that works with these guys, it won't be too obvious up here or too obvious down there. So we've made a bit of progress and had a change of location for reasons I won't go into, but I have finished all the whip stitching on the 3 areas that need it, and I've taken out the 2 layers of tacking as well. And now what we need to do is basically remove this paper. We could probably wiggle it out, but in actual fact I'm going to cut it free, much as we did when we did the, what was it called? Oh yeah, the wonky 9 patch, and we put a little wonky square in the middle of the wonky 9 patch and appliqued it on and then cut it free. It's exactly the same technique. So I'm being generous now. I'm probably leaving closer to ½ an inch of a margin here, because I basically don't want to undo all my good work by cutting through the wrong bit. And we may not be able to cut all the way to the top, I'll see. No, actually, I think we will just manage it. There we go. And then there's a little bit more excess to take off around here. And what usually happens to me in these situations is I cut out a bit and I look at it and I think, what could I make with that? So if you see it again in the second block, don't be surprised. And then we can easily just remove the paper, which just gave us a nice stiff edge to sew along. And there we go. Once that's had a pressing, we're ready to start adding our little circles to it, which will happen in part 3.